challenging. Why should voters trust your commitments?
We haven't abandoned anything, Sarah.
Clarity is key.
My jaw fell to the floor.
Canada is not going to be the 51st state of the United States.
In the absence of answers, we challenge. Is it possible that you never find out what happened?
I don't know.
Every week, we're making sense of our ever-changing world.
We've never seen anything like that.
All in one place.
7:30 tonight, ABC TV and ABC iView. The groundbreaking show that captured the nation.
It was one of those weird TV dreams that actually came true.
8 young filmmakers race around the world.
What could possibly go wrong?
Just find someone on the street and peel them like an onion.
Their untold stories of survival.
It was a health and safety nightmare.
I got robbed, I got mugged.
Nervous breakdown territory.
We could have died and they didn't know about it.
Australian Story.
We were a family who shared something really amazing.
Tonight at 8, ABC.
The federal election is on. Head to ABC News Online for the latest news, analysis, live blogs and policy promises. What they mean for you. Be part of the conversation with your say. Tell us what's on your mind, what questions you want answered. Plus Anthony Green's guide to key seats and daily updates from the ABC's unrivalled team of experts.
Your vote, your say. Go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes.
You're with ABC News. It's 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time and 6 a.m. in the West, where the Prime Minister is campaigning today. Well, welcome to the ABC's new studio in Parramatta in Western Sydney. It is the start of the first full week of the election campaign. We're going to take you live to our reporters travelling with the leaders shortly. Also ahead today, a woman and 3 children stabbed at a home in Sydney's northwest. We're going to speak to our reporters soon, and we're also expecting an update from police later on this hour. Donald Trump vows to punish Vladimir Putin with oil tariffs if he feels Moscow is blocking efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Mr. Trump has also threatened to bomb Iran if it doesn't agree to a nuclear deal. Residents in Queensland's southwest on high alert as floodwaters flow downstream. In northern New South Wales, some towns could be cut off for up to 6 weeks. And Muslims around the world celebrate the end of Ramadan and the start of Eid. It is Monday, the 31st of March. I'm Gemma Veness, coming to you for the very first time from the land of the Darug people in Parramatta in Western Sydney. This is ABC News Mornings. And it is great to have your company as we broadcast from our new home in Parramatta for the very first time. This coincides with the first full week of the federal election campaign. Voters in Western Sydney will play a critical role in deciding the outcome of this election, making us perfectly placed to speak to key stakeholders about the issues that matter in the so-called mortgage belt. This is the cost of living election, and nowhere is it more keenly felt than right here. Now, the leaders of the major parties hit the road over the weekend, targeting key battleground electorates. The opposition leader Peter Dutton made a beeline for Labor's Western Sydney heartland yesterday, where Labor-held seats are under threat. Now, later in the hour, the ABC's elections analyst Casey Briggs will join me at the desk for a lay of the land in Western Sydney. First, though, let's go to political reporter Tom Lowry, who is travelling with the Prime Minister and joins us now from Perth. Now, Tom, what is the Prime Minister doing in WA?
Yeah, good morning, Gemma. It's a bit interesting to see the Prime Minister travelling west so early in the election campaign, but WA has been very good to Labor in recent years. The last election, just 3 years ago, Labor picked up 4 seats in WA. It would love to hold all of them. The Prime Minister has tried to make a real point during this last term in office of not taking WA for granted. He's made something like 30 trips out west over the past 3 years and has now come here very, very early on. If Labor can hold all 4 of those seats here in the West, plus be competitive in the new seat of Bullwinkle, that's a 3-way contest between Labor, the Liberals and the National Party, that would make it pretty difficult for Peter Dutton to find a path to office. He is coming with an offering for the West here today, $200 million for the St John of God Midland Hospital, so clearly trying to continue to make that case to WA voters to keep up that relationship and make clear he's not taking them for granted.
And Tom, a YouGov poll has Labor favouring better in recent weeks. How is the government responding to that?
Yeah, there's actually been a few polls that have come out over the past couple of days, Gemma, all showing sort of shifts in Labor's direction just in the past couple of weeks or so. A news poll this morning, a Resolve poll as well, and that YouGov poll you've mentioned. Now, none of them are showing commanding leads for Labor or anything like that. This is still a very tight contest, but clearly that little shift towards Labor just at the start of this campaign. That said, Labor figures say they're not reading too much into the polls at this point. Here's the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, speaking on this morning.
This is a close election. I think everyone knows we're coming from behind. That's the way in which we're proceeding here. But we're also really focused on making sure that we are telling the story to the Australian people about what we've done in relation to focusing on cost of living relief, which has really been our focus since the time that we've come into power.
So the Deputy Prime Minister making the point there, this is still a very close contest. Politicians will always tell you the only poll that counts is the one on election day, but they certainly keep an eye on the polls on the way through.
Yeah, they certainly do. Political reporter Tom Lowry in Perth, thank you. And now to Isabel Rowe, who's travelling with the opposition leader. Isabel, where is the opposition leader today and what is he doing?
Well, we've all just pulled up in the Hunter, which is mining town, and it is really Labor heartland, but it is certainly an area that Peter Dutton has his eye on. There are a couple of seats here that he is particularly keen on. We're currently in the seat of Patterson, and that is a seat that's held by Meryl Swanson, and the Liberal Party are running Lawrence Ancliffe, so quite a prominent local candidate. Peter Dutton is on his way here. We've just pulled up to a mining equipment company called Cougar. We understand the opposition will be talking about their energy plans today, about the fuel excise, the policies that they say will bring down the cost of energy and help businesses like this one.
And Isabel, the opposition has also commented on these latest opinion polls.
Yeah, and we haven't heard from Peter Dutton yet this morning. We are expecting to very shortly, but we have heard from James Patterson, who is, of course, the spokesperson for the Dutton campaign. As usual, when these sorts of polls come out, neither party likes to place too much weight on them, but it does represent a trend towards Labor and towards the Prime Minister, and we heard from Senator Patterson on this earlier.
No, I'm not concerned. What these polls show is that the election is close, that it'll be decided in the campaign. We've got a very positive message about how we'll get our country back on track, how we'll improve Australians' financial circumstances, how we'll make our communities safe. And Peter Dutton is a strong leader who can deliver on that.
James Patterson there. So as I said, we're just waiting for Peter Dutton to show up here and put on the high vis. I think I'm already wearing it, and we'll hear from him shortly.
Yeah, it's a good choice there. Isabel Rowe in Newcastle, thank you. Well, as you've heard, ABC Mornings starts broadcasting from Western Sydney today. This is where 10% of Australia's population lives. So whoever forms government needs to win over the voters here. Tony Ibrahim is the local communities reporter and joins me now in the studio. Tony, welcome. Now, who lives in Western Sydney? What are the demographics here?
Big chunk of the country does, 10%, as you said. It's larger than Sydney, it's growing quicker than Sydney, and its population is generally younger than Sydney. It's best to break it down into two parts. They're two quite different parts. There's the inner core. When you think of this, you should think of areas like Canterbury, Bankstown, Fairfield, Liverpool, Parramatta. Yeah. This is a very dense area. It's considered the most multicultural area in the country. It's full of different cuisines, different languages, different religions, different cultures. Some parts are historically low socioeconomic, but as migrants have had children who have gone on to study and get better paying jobs, there's been a transition to middle class, you could say. The other part is the outer ring. These are areas like the Hawkesbury, Wollondilly, the Blue Mountains. It's a much bigger area. There's a lot less people who live in there. It's predominantly English in background, a bit more traditional. And you should think more of the Australian bushland. All up, combined, it's a real cross-section of our country.
A big population, as you said. Now, you've been with the ABC in Parramatta for several years now. Can you take us through some of the key issues that you've encountered in your reporting and when you've been speaking with people? And, I mean, we have to start with housing. It's a huge issue in this election.
I think a lot of people are struggling with housing costs, but it's very acute in Western Sydney. In Liverpool and in Campbelltown, they have some of the highest housing stress. Now, according to the last census, the number of mortgages where repayments were more than $4,000 has doubled in the last decade in Western Sydney. And this is in an area where, about half of the people there bring home an income of $2,000. I remember interviewing a single mum who lived on the outskirts of Greater Sydney in Oakdale, and every time mortgage repayments went up, she would have to think about where she could cut fat from in the budget. Started with holidays, and then it got to the point where she would think, can I turn on the dryer? Which requires a lot of mental exertion, but it's also not mortgage payers who are feeling the pinch. Renters are struggling. In the last 5 years, the number of renters who are spending more than $650 a week, that's doubled in the last 5 years. It's particularly noticeable in the Blue Mountains, which is a very competitive market. I was speaking to the mayor there, and there's 1,100 rental properties, but 1,000 of them are on short-term sites like Airbnb. And it's led to the locals taking to the streets to protest and hold rallies because they're feeling like they can't afford to live in an area they call home, and they're being pushed further out. So when these people go to the ballot box, they're going to be thinking about the roof over their heads.
What are the other issues they'll be thinking about when they go to vote?
They care about the things they need. So they want to know, am I bringing enough money in to afford this high cost of living? Can I pay my rent? Can I put food on the table? Can I send my kids to a good school? Do we have good education systems? Healthcare is a big problem. 2/3 of the people with type 2 diabetes live in Western Sydney. They care about their public transport network because it's a bit more remote than the eastern side. And the road network. I think of the people in Austral where 30,000 homes were built in greenfield spacing. They can't get past 15th Avenue without sitting in gridlock for 45 minutes. So when they go to the ballot box, they're going to be thinking about the building blocks that make their lives just a little bit easier.
Tony, how engaged are these people in politics?
It's a really diverse area. We can't brush them in a single stroke. Generally, they don't care much for the celebrity of politicians. They're just thinking about how to get through life as easy as possible. I should say they'll be paying attention to their day-to-day needs. An overwhelming majority will vote. And I'm going to underscore that. An overwhelming majority will vote. But there are migrants and there are refugees in these areas, and they struggle to trust their former governments and their former media and their former police forces. And they're still learning to trust our institutions. So there will be some who cast invalid votes. It's either that they're not particularly engaged, or I should say they don't want to make ripples. They just want to keep their head down and get on with it.
And how has the growth that we've seen in Western Sydney really changed the face of Greater Sydney?
Well, we had one city, Sydney, on the Eastern Harbour. People would go to work there and they wanted to live close to there. So that's where they would buy their homes. And some people who couldn't afford that would move further west. Now, for these people, they were spending more money on roads, on fuels, on toll, and they were spending more time on this. The state government realised that this isn't sustainable for growth and for productivity. So it came up with a plan to rebalance Greater Sydney, would elevate Parramatta and Liverpool so that they could be employment centres and people would get to work within 30 minutes. They spent billions and billions and billions of dollars making this a reality. It's still playing out. We've got the airport coming online in Western Sydney next year. We've got the West Connects. We've got the Metro driverless train station, Parramatta Light Rail. All of this has been intended to rebalance Greater Sydney, to spill opportunity from the eastern side of the state across the rest of Greater Sydney. And it's probably some of the most significant changes in Greater Sydney's history in recent times.
It's great to have you on board with us. Tony Ibrahim, our local communities reporter. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let's go to Parliament House in Canberra now. Jacob Grieber is our Chief Digital Political Correspondent. Now, Jacob, the Prime Minister has headed west pretty early in the campaign. What's your take on this?
Nice to see you in your new digs this morning. It looks sharp from down this end. He's heading west because it's such a critical part of the overall picture. WA, as my colleague who's travelling with the Prime Minister pointed out, Tom Lowry pointed out a few moments ago, there was 4 seats there that Labor picked up in 2022. Labor has a 3-seat majority in the parliament that's just finished. So that's how tight the numbers are. The West has been a place where the Labor brand is in good shape. The state election was very strong in Labor's favour. That was only a few weeks ago. And the Prime Minister has been there close to 30 times. This might be his 30th trip. I'm not quite sure on the details, but it's that scale since 2022, since he became Prime Minister. He is handing out money for a hospital, local hospital there, and he'll be talking about why he's friendly to a state like Western Australia with its huge resources industries, iron ore and gas in particular. And he's sending a message that this is a Labor government that's supportive of those industries. And he can expect that, all things being equal, the pendulum would have shifted away from Labor over these years, but he needs to hang on to those wins from last time.
Jacob, how did the weekend campaigning go for the leaders?
Look, it kicked off in its expected sort of relatively frantic pace. There were a bunch of different things that really cut through. The Prime Minister and Labor announcing a supermarkets policy on Sunday morning. Not a lot of detail on that one, frankly, kind of has the vibe of a sort of a slogan and a headline rather than any real policy meat on that. The argument being, I think, supermarkets that, quote, take the piss are the ones that are going to be targeted. That's not a particularly sharp, useful piece of language when it comes to the law, which is what this is ultimately about, and the competition regulator cracking down on that type of price gouging where and when it happens. The opposition more emphasising its plan to get energy prices down, and you could say equally there's a lack of detail there around how it's going to manage getting more gas into the economy, which is what opposition leader Peter Dutton announced in his budget reply speech on Thursday night. He says he will get gas prices down to $10 a gigajoule. They're currently just under $14 by the end of this calendar year, and that'll lead to lower energy prices. Devil in the detail, though.
Now, Peter Dutton chose to head to Western Sydney yesterday. What was the significance of that?
So it's you're beaming out of Western Sydney. It's one of the key battlegrounds in this election. There are a lot of seats in Western Sydney, and I guess the equivalent kind of regions in Melbourne and Brisbane. These are mortgage belts. These are areas with large ethnic communities. And it's where the cost of living crisis has been felt very acutely. People are struggling with their transport costs. Peter Dutton has a policy to cut the fuel excise immediately by 20 cents. That's about half, a little over 20 cents, I should say, per litre. That would bring, he says, immediate relief to those communities where people do have to commute a long way. So he's gone, I guess, into Labor heartland, but the coalition feels these are seats they can bring back to their side of the ledger.
And what about the coalition's gas reservation policy? I mean, how has it been received with voters and the industry? Is it likely that Labor would do similar?
Well, we'll wait and see on Labor. My sense is they're really still watching, gauging the reaction. The response from the industry has been verging on apoplectic, it has to be said. Certainly that's what they're telling me. They're very unhappy with the gas reservation idea. Not the concept per se, but the fact that the version that Peter Dutton announced on Thursday in his budget reply speech very much affects existing investments, existing infrastructure, much of which is devoted to exporting gas to very lucrative offshore markets. Some of them anyway, were okay with the idea of a reservation that only affects future gas projects. And remember, this is a Commonwealth area. It can only really do this on offshore gas. So this is places like off the northwest shelf of WA and off the Northern Territory. Both are locations that are not particularly useful for the East Coast gas market because we don't have pipelines that cross the continent. You'd need to put gas on ships, LNG ships, bring it back east and then turn it back into gas. All very expensive and also, frankly, the sort of things that take a long time to be put into practice. So they're the sort of questions that hang over this policy. The other thing the industry is very concerned about is if this reservation is imposed as it's been described, and as I said, we don't have a lot of detail, but as described, that could lead to less gas being available on the East Coast because there's less of an incentive, the industry says, to extract gas. And to take gas out, it's not just a tap that you turn on and off. You have to spend a lot of money every year, some $4 billion in Queensland alone to get the gas out.
Jacob, is there a sense that Labor's bad polling is shifting somewhat?
Well, this has been brewing for 4, 5, 6 weeks, you could say. Early sense that the polls were starting to shift. Certainly they've narrowed, and as you've been reporting this morning, there's a flurry of polls out over the last 24 hours or so, all pointing to the same thing, which is that it's about neck and neck in terms of two-party preferred. There's been a shift, it seems, towards Labor's primary. That's picking up somewhat. And both sides will say, well, that's probably inevitable because there was an unusually large, or there still is an unusually large undecided vote, which is indicative perhaps that people are not happy with what they've got right now, but they haven't shifted over to Peter Dutton in the numbers that he would need to get a majority of his own right. He has a big mountain to climb. He's got to pick up something like 20 seats, whereas Labor has a 3-seat majority. They only need to lose a few seats, and then they're in minority. The polls as they stand now, and I would take them with a grain of salt this early in the campaign, a lot can and will change in these polls, but they would have Labor pretty close to a majority in its own right.
And you wrote a piece yesterday about a moment that may come back to bite Peter Dutton. Can you tell us what happened and why it could be problematic?
Well, it was a sort of funny moment where he interviewed himself, in a sense, at a press conference and asked the question, does anyone think that Labor can win a majority? And he paused for, I counted almost 6 seconds as he looked around the gallery. No one, or the press pack that was with him, no one responded. And then he answered his own question and said, essentially that no one thinks Labor can win a majority. Now, in the 24 hours since, we've seen polls that on paper, I stress, on paper, actually might give Labor a majority. So it's one of those funny sort of moments. We might come back to it later in the campaign as perhaps demonstrating a bit of hubris. Now, I think the point he's making as well is that he believes whatever happens, voters are going to put a parliament in place where the crossbench has a lot of clout. And that's going to hang over this campaign all the way to the finish line. Which side is sending signals to that crossbench? How will that crossbench split? There are some who you would say would be natural coalition supporters, and then there are others who are natural Labor supporters. And the voters in the seats where they're electing these independents, the Teals, some of them have more of a National Party sort of flavour to them. Some of them obviously leaning more Labor, Green. Both sides are going to push, both of the major parties are going to push those candidates to reveal which way they'll jump if there is a hung parliament.
Jacob Gruber, our Chief Digital Political Correspondent, thank you. Iran has rejected the prospect of direct talks with the US over its nuclear program. It comes as Donald Trump threatens military force in an interview with US media. Emily Grimenz is in Washington, DC and joins us now. Emily, what's the latest on this?
Well, Iran seems to have rejected Donald Trump's overtures for direct talks for a new nuclear deal. Of course, Donald Trump pulled out of an existing nuclear deal with Iran in his first term in office. That deal limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Iran has long maintained that its nuclear program is strictly for peaceful purposes, but Western powers do believe that it is developing capability for a nuclear weapon. Now, since his return to office, Donald Trump has been sharpening his rhetoric on Iran. He's given a phone interview to NBC News where he's threatened bombing and secondary tariffs if Iran does not agree to a new deal. He wrote a letter to Iran's supreme leader earlier this month, and Iran's regime has now made its response to that more public. Here's what the Iranian president had to say.
Direct negotiations have been rejected, but regarding indirect talks, Iran has always been involved in such talks, and the Supreme Leader has emphasised that indirect talks can still continue. We don't avoid talks. It's the breach of promises that has caused issues for us so far.
Donald Trump's comments about threatening bombing and secondary tariffs did take place in an interview before those comments from Iran's president. Now, speaking to the same network, he's also lashed out at Vladimir Putin over the weekend. The Trump administration is seeking to bring the war in Ukraine to an end, something Donald Trump previously said he could do in one day. It seems he's frustrated with Mr. Putin. He's told the same journalist at NBC News that he's very angry that Mr. Putin has criticised Ukraine's leader Volodymyr Zelensky, and he said he could also impose further tariffs on Russia. He's threatened a levy of up to 50% on imports of any Russian oil into the United States.
Emily Gramenz in Washington, DC. Authorities in Myanmar say the death toll from the devastating earthquake has risen to at least 1,700. The magnitude 7.7 tremor struck on Friday near the country's second largest city. The country's military leader there, and about 3,400 people are injured, and about 300 still missing. International aid is finally starting to reach those in need, with the widespread destruction hampering rescue and recovery efforts.
Many homes has been destroyed. Road and bridge damage. Many children and families are still missing and traumatized. We need urgent assistance, especially for the children, who often suffer the most in these kinds of situations.
In Bangkok, at least 18 people have been confirmed killed in the collapse of an unfinished high-rise building, with 78 missing. Authorities say an extensive search and rescue mission is underway.
I cannot say that I feel good at all, but we are working around the clock, and the only determination that we have in common is to be able to find the survivors.
And East Asia correspondent Kathleen Calderwood joins us now from Bangkok. Kathleen, we'll get to the situation in Thailand in just a moment. First, though, what is the latest out of Myanmar?
It's a really devastating situation in Myanmar. The death toll has passed 1,700, and the leader of the military junta there has told people to prepare for that number to increase. That death toll has risen sharply over the weekend, and thousands are injured as well. There have been multiple aftershocks in Myanmar, which have really caused panic among people there. Not far from the epicentre of the quake, a resident has told the ABC that a residential tower 11 stories high collapsed, and that they are still trying to rescue people out of that tower. They can hear people screaming from inside, but they just don't have enough equipment to move through that quickly. So we're seeing lots of accounts like that where people are being rescued by hand because they don't have the kind of heavy machinery like you can see here behind me in Thailand. Now, there are aid teams arriving. Ones from China, India, Russia, Singapore and Thailand have arrived, but they've arrived in Yangon because the Mandalay airport has been badly affected, and they've got an hours-long drive in front of them. And we are hearing that, of course, a lot of infrastructure, roads and bridges have been badly affected, and that, of course, is really impeding that effort to get aid to the people who need it most. And on top of all this, there are accusations now that the military junta has continued to carry out airstrikes since the earthquake, so really compounding an already devastating situation in a country that's been in the midst of civil war now for years.
Kathleen, what is happening behind you there?
So we're at the site of the more than 30-storey building which collapsed when the earthquake hit on Friday. So as you can see, they are using enormous cranes to try and get through that concrete. The building has really pancaked down on itself. You can see the layers of concrete. Now, they believe that there are still around 80 people trapped inside. We were previously reporting from a bit closer. They've moved everyone back in the last 24 hours or so, and we think that they might be trying to get in underneath. We've spoken to a worker who said that there is actually, there was a basement, and he said that he thought that only people who'd made it to that basement would be able to survive. So it is coming up on 72 hours now. The time pressure pressure is really on to find survivors, but remarkably overnight there have been reports that some signs of life have been found, and we've seen that there's a crew right at the top of the building as well. They're trying to get in from the top. Now, the other tragic part of this, of course, is that there are dozens and dozens of families here waiting to find out news of their loved ones, and it does seem that a majority of the workers on that site were Burmese. So not only are they trying to find out information about what's happened back home in Myanmar, somewhere it's already hard enough to get information out of, they're now here waiting to hear about their loved ones. So we spoke to a gentleman from Myanmar who believes his brother is trapped underneath the rubble.
They haven't told us anything about the safety of the construction. We haven't got any information so far. We've lost contact. We haven't got any updates about my brother. The name is in their hospital admissions list, but they did not tell us which hospital. The names of the deceased persons were not disclosed to us. I'm feeling very overwhelmed, and we feel very deeply.
So there's a huge rescue effort going on here. Hundreds of military, police, paramedics, specialist rescuers, and they're also being supported by many, many volunteers and people from community organisations who are trying to keep them fed and watered, but also looking after those families. Questions too are being raised about the safety of this building. We heard from the country's industry minister that samples of the steel have been taken for testing, and the Deputy Prime Minister said that also a committee has been set up to investigate exactly why this building collapsed so violently when there was so little significant damage elsewhere in Bangkok, and they're expecting a report back from that investigation within the week.
East Asia correspondent Kathleen Calderwood in Bangkok, thank you. There are calls for further investigation into the full extent of corrupt cop Mark Standen's crimes. The disgraced former Crime Commission investigator served 16 years in prison. He's the most senior crime fighter to be convicted of conspiring to import drugs. Standen has broken his silence, as new evidence suggests his criminal activity ran far deeper than first thought. Janine Cohen from Four Corners joins us now. Janine, you've been on this story for over a decade. Can you tell me about Mark Standen? Some of us remember him, many wouldn't though. Who is he?
Mark Standen is the most senior ever crime fighter to be convicted of a major drug import. He was lauded and respected. He brought down many criminals in his career, but it seems that he was playing a double game, protecting criminals while pretending to investigate them at the same time.
He's been in jail for 16 years. That seems like time served. Why bring all this up now?
Well, because there's people saying that they are collateral damage. There's people that have had their careers destroyed. There's people that have had no closure. There's also, we've now got new documents and evidence that his criminality was far wider than first thought, that in fact the AFP believed he was complicit in multiple imports, that he sabotaged investigations into organised crime, and that he blamed other police officers for this as well.
And why is this significant today?
It's significant because what experts argue is if you don't go to the bottom of his crimes and if you don't have full transparency, it could happen again. But also there's a belief by some people that some of the criminals he worked with are still dealing drugs and bringing drugs into the country. And, you know, those sort of things need to be investigated.
Janine Cohen from Four Corners, thank you.
Thank you.
And you can see that full story on Four Corners at 8:30 tonight on ABC TV or anytime on ABC iView. Live across Australia on ABC TV and streaming on ABC iView and online. You're with ABC News Mornings. I'm Gemma Veness, coming to you from our studio in Parramatta in Western Sydney. And these are the top stories we're following this hour. The Prime Minister is spending the day 3 of the election campaign in Perth, hoping Western Australia can deliver Labor more electoral success. The party made huge ground in the West at the last federal election, picking up 4 seats. Meanwhile, opposition leader Peter Dutton will start the day in the New South Wales Hunter region to spruik his energy plans. Police are investigating after a woman and 3 children were stabbed in northwest Sydney. The 46-year-old woman, 2 girls aged 13 and 16 and a 10-year-old boy were found at a home in Baulkham Hills at around 5:20 this morning. All 4 are in hospital in a stable condition. Police have set up a crime scene at the property. US President Donald Trump has escalated his rhetoric towards Iran, threatening bombings and more tariffs if the country doesn't agree to a nuclear deal. He's also vowing to punish Vladimir Putin with oil tariffs if he feels Moscow is blocking efforts to end the war in Ukraine. And major flood warnings remain in place for communities across southwest Queensland. Record-breaking rainfall has lashed the region for nearly a week, cutting off towns, destroying crops and isolating livestock. Flood warnings are also in place for many river systems in northern New South Wales. Well, let's get more on the election campaign now. The ABC's elections analyst Casey Briggs joins us in the studio. Casey, welcome. And this is where we're broadcasting from today in Western Sydney. This is where 10% of the country's population lives. What happens here will naturally influence the vote, won't it?
Yeah, g'day, Gemma. Nice to be joining you from the Commonwealth Electoral Division of Parramatta. This time of the electoral cycle is when I start to think in terms of electorates rather than suburbs. Yeah, look, this is a really important part of the country in this election because, yes, there are a lot of people here, which means there are a lot of seats here. But if you look at the electoral pendulum, you can see why New South Wales is so important. For the Coalition to win majority government, they would need to pick up 19 seats in this election. If you just look at the first 19 most marginal Labor seats, 8 of them are in New South Wales. 3 of them are in Western Sydney in particular, and if you broaden out to look at the Central Coast and the Hunter region as well, you get another 4. So there's a significant swag of seats in this region where there are particular commonalities in issues, the cost of living crisis, mortgage stress, access to things like healthcare that are biting across this entire region, as well as the sort of transport issues that Tony was talking about earlier. This is going to be one of the key battlegrounds in this election.
So let's go to the key seats at play, and we'll start with Parramatta, currently held by Labor. Is this a safe seat for Labor?
Well, it has been. Labor's held it since 2004. This seat is on a 3.7% margin. What we're seeing is in this part of the country, seats that Labor has held for quite some time are getting slowly more marginal. There have been quite a few boundary changes in Parramatta as well. It gets nudged back and forth as the North Shore of Sydney grows and shrinks and the population changes there. In the last round of redistributions, it did lose some of the Labor voting areas south of the M4. Andrew Charlton holds this seat at the moment. It's going to be one of those key signs for, well, look, a 3.7% swing is all it would take to lose it. It's one of the ones that the Coalition would be hoping to pick up. If they can hold on here, if Labor can hold on here, it'll be a very good sign for them retaining government. Broaden out seats like Reid as well in Western Sydney. Labor's only held that since 2022, but it does have a long Labor history. It's only been really held by the Coalition during the last Coalition government between 2013 and 2022. Reid's named after one of the lesser-known PMs, George Reid, who was PM for 11 months in 1904. Again, a seat that used to be a safe Labor seat is now considerably more marginal. And other seats that we haven't really talked about as being in play in previous elections, seats like Werriwa, which is growing again, increasingly more marginal. 5.3% is the margin at the moment. It's never not been a Labor seat. What we're watching for this election is to see if cost of living, but also a sort of broader disaffection with government, dissatisfaction with politics as usual might hurt the Labor vote here. There are polls that have been suggesting that could be a seat. Other seats like it, or similar looking seats in Melbourne as well, in the outer reaches of Melbourne, could be in play here. If that is the kind of seat that goes, if we start seeing seats like Werriwa in Melbourne, seats like Hawke and McEwen, that's a bit of a sign that Labor's got some maybe more structural problems to think through, because these are the kinds of seats that you would call Labor heartland. If you start losing them and you're the Labor Party, you have a problem.
Now, there was a lot of attention on the seat of Fowler at the last election. So the story there that Labor infamously parachuted Christina Keneally into that seat. She lost to independent Dai Lee, who's a Vietnamese immigrant with ties to the community. Tu Lee was overlooked for pre-selection in that. Labor now seems to have learnt their lesson, and they're putting her up against Dai Lee. What are her chances this time round?
Yeah, Labor's got to really rebuild trust with the community here after that, I think we can say, spectacularly bad pick for a candidate, someone that, you know, lived on Scotland Island on the north shore of Sydney, coming into Western Sydney, a very culturally diverse area, did not really gel with the electorate, and the electorate responded. The problem for Labor is winning a seat that you don't hold is much harder than holding a seat that you do have. Di Lee has the advantages of incumbency. She's had 3 years now to build connections. She's got, you know, the resources of a parliamentarian. So Di Lee, when you look at polling that's been around, her vote does seem to be holding up. She is maybe, of the independents, one of the ones that would be more at risk, because this is, you know, it is a traditional kind of Labor voting area, but Labor's really got a challenge here to overcome the trust that it broke with people 3 years ago, and the fact that they are no longer the incumbents. People have seen another option, and the history of independents in Australia's parliament is, once they're elected, it is very hard to dislodge them. Not impossible, but it is difficult.
We mentioned a few seats there. Are there any others that you want to talk about that are at play here?
Well, Western Sydney's got a number of these examples of the way that we're seeing politics continue to fragment as well. In Brisbane, you're seeing it with the Greens. In inner Sydney, you're seeing it with the Teal Independents. We have these candidates running that were really motivated to run in Western Sydney on a platform of the war in Gaza, the issue of how Australia is handling that conflict, including in a couple of very safe Labor seats. Blaxland, that's the seat held by Jason Clare, the Education Minister, and Tony Burke, seat of Watson. We've got two candidates there. It's an example, I think, of this, you know, increasing complexity of the electorate. I think it's a really tall order for these independent candidates to get up. In order to be successful, you need a relatively strong primary vote, and you need to start collecting preferences from, you know, traditional Liberal voters. I think it's going to be really difficult. But what we might see is, and we'll watch for on election night, to see if the Labor primary vote in those seats goes down, because it could just be another vector, another axis of complexity, as we're seeing more and more and more of these contests become non-traditional two-party races, and politics getting, you know, more and more and more local in so many ways.
Now, Casey, you released exclusive polling yesterday, and we have covered that off a little bit this morning, but what was the snapshot of it? Yeah,
what we reported yesterday was a what's called a multi-level regression with post-stratification model. You and I, let's just call it MRP. It was done by YouGov. They've been doing these regularly through the campaign. They're not the only ones doing it, but they are a sort of more sophisticated, expensive form of modelling than a traditional poll. The upshot of that, I'll just explain quickly, it's based on tens of thousands of interviews, 38,000 interviews in this case, that are then modelled across all of the electorates to produce not just an estimate of the seat, the vote share, but also the seat share, who will win each individual seat. What we've learned yesterday is the Labor improvement that we've seen in the broader opinion polling industry in the last 6 weeks or so, it does appear to be real. We've seen 3 polls yesterday that sort of confirm that. This one suggests that Labor even might have a chance of winning majority government. The central estimate of that poll was 75 seats to Labor. 76 is a majority, so they're close. 60 for the coalition. It sort of suggests there are lots and lots of seats on a line ball. There are lots of seats that are very close. But Labor has really improved. 6 weeks ago, this same MRP exercise had the coalition well ahead. So Labor's, you know, relatively modest improvement in vote share looks like it might convert into a real improvement in the number of seats they were possibly looking at even just 6 weeks ago. It's all very close. I'm not making any bold predictions about who will win this election, but I think the position for Labor has gotten significantly stronger in the last 6 weeks. Anthony Albanese and the Labor camp would be much more optimistic than they were even 6 weeks ago.
Casey, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, let's head to outback Queensland now, where floodwaters continue to wreak havoc. Our reporter Grace Nakamura joins us from Longreach. Grace, what's the latest there?
Morning, Gemma. Well, we've heard this morning about 70 people have been evacuated from their homes and moved to higher ground in the southwest Queensland town of Thargomindah, where they're preparing for further flooding today. This extreme weather event started about midway through last week with prolonged heavy rainfall. As you can see around me, that rainfall has cleared, but the disaster is still unfolding in parts of outback Queensland. The focus today is on these towns, Thargomindah and Yulo. Yulo is close to the New South Wales border. Over the weekend, some of the levees were breached in parts due to this floodwater coming through. but this is truly unprecedented flooding for this part of outback Queensland. This has eclipsed the 1974 flood, which for many residents out here was the most destructive flood they can remember. But the Bellew River in Thargomindah at the moment has now reached 6.85 metres and is still continuing to rise. So residents in these towns have seen the destruction the floodwaters have brought to towns further north of them, and today are just bracing themselves for what's to come.
The real economic impact and what will flow through the community is the devastation to agriculture, and we're going to have to make sure that we continue in the short term to deliver fuel and fodder, which the work's been going around the clock to do that, to give every hope where there is dry land to be able to keep those animals fed. And then in the long term, we're going to need to lead a big recovery, including re-establishing exclusion fencing and helping them restock after what will be really devastating scenes.
So that's Queensland Premier David Crisafulli. He was in outback Queensland last week speaking there because the agricultural industry will certainly be the hardest hit here. AgForce President Shane McCarthy spoke to us earlier today. He said it's hard to know just how much stock has been lost because the floodwaters are still present. Graziers haven't been able to get out and about to actually measure the full extent of the damage. But he says he's spoken to some people who've lost 100% of their stock. And at this stage, it's about trying to keep that cattle alive. And one of the major concerns here is for getting enough aviation fuel. Choppers have been integral to the effort here to make sure that they can get people out safely, they can take cattle to higher ground, and they can even bring food and medication supplies to towns that have been cut off for days and will likely continue to be cut off. So in this part of outback Queensland, it's very much a waiting game. The Weather Bureau says that more rainfall is forecast tomorrow and into Wednesday into already saturated parts of Queensland, which is bringing anxiety for people who've already had to weather this storm so far.
Grace Nakamura reporting from Longreach in Queensland. Thank you. And we are taking you now to Sydney, where police have spoken after a woman and 3 children were found with stab wounds overnight.
Police and ambulance service arrived within minutes. Police, upon entry to the house, located 4 people suffering varying stab wounds. 3 children, the eldest being 16, who had 1 stab wound and a number of lacerations, a 13-year-old female who had 3 stab wounds, and a 10-year-old male who had 2 stab wounds. There was also a 47-year-old female in the home, who we will allege is the mother, who was also suffering 3 stab wounds to her abdomen. The 5th person in the home, being the father, was the person who contacted police and assisted police on arrival at the scene. Police and ambulance service provided first aid to all of those persons, secured a weapon, declared a crime scene, and have placed under arrest that 47-year-old mother. The 47-year-old and the 3 children are all currently receiving varying degrees of medical treatment at a nearby hospital. The female is under arrest and is under police guard, and we are currently at the scene with a crime scene warrant, processing that crime scene as we speak.
Can you tell us where the father was, what he was doing, and his stepfather?
Look, we believe the father was in the home at the time. We believe the father and the children were all in their rooms and potentially all of them asleep when the mother has carried out this act. Upon waking up to what I would believe to be a number of screams or yells, he's then gone to approach the situation, and from what I am told, has secured the weapon and he's contacted police. Yeah, as I said when I started, it's a family home, and that family home is really not known to police, if I'm honest with you. The 3 children all attend local schools, a relatively normal family, and if I can say to you, this is probably completely unexpected. There's certainly no domestic violence history reported to police on our records. There's no AVOs. This is the first time police have responded to this house for any type of domestic situation.
Those police speaking in Sydney after a woman and 3 children were found with stab wounds overnight. The 46-year-old woman, 2 girls aged 13 and 16 and a 10-year-old boy were found at a home in Baulkham Hills at around 5:20 this morning. Now let's return to the federal election campaign. Joining me in the studio is Professor Andy Marks, who's a political scientist and Executive Director of the Centre for Western Sydney. Now, Professor Marks, welcome to our Parramatta studios.
It's great to be here. Good to have you guys in Para.
Yeah, and great to have you. Now, Western Sydney, it's a very highly engaged population when it comes to politics, and that's not just anecdotal. We actually see that in the sorts of swings we see in elections, don't we?
We do, and we start to see Western Sydney behave in a way that's probably more dynamic than the rest of the country, in a really hyper-local way. So what happens, for example, in southwestern Sydney can be very different to what happens in other parts of Western Sydney. They are very switched on and very attuned to independence and other issues as well.
Now, Western Sydney, it has a younger demographic. Does that give major and minor parties a bit of a clue, some insights into issues that will maybe gain significance in future and perhaps voting patterns that might change in future as well?
Yeah, it does. Western Sydney is a bit of a snapshot of what Australia will be like in the main in 5 to 10 years. So very culturally diverse, a lot younger, I guess, in some of those high growth areas. So some of the issues that will matter for Western Sydney voters, like, for example, the plight of renters ahead of mortgage holders, will be to the fore in this election. I think also in inner southwestern Sydney, you're going to start to see geopolitical issues and other things that you probably wouldn't see elsewhere in the electorate.
So, I mean, elections, they come around often. Is this election of particular significance for Western Sydney?
I think it is. I think that they shocked themselves a little bit last election with the election of the independent Daly and Fowler. So it really said to the major parties as well that they can't consider any seat in Western Sydney squared away. And there has been that drift away from the major parties in Western Sydney in a more accelerated way than we've seen elsewhere in the country. So I think we might see some surprises by way of independence and preference flows.
And what are the key issues that will dominate, and also any particular issues for this area?
Look, Gemma, this is a situation in which the rule "all politics is local" really applies. So in Western Sydney, yes, they are engaged in those national issues, but it's about connecting infrastructure. It's about, for the people in southwestern Sydney in particular, that housing has grown at a very rapid rate and it's eclipsed the rate of infrastructure growth. So this is about people who don't have the services that people in other parts of the country have, and that's what they're going to be demanding. So some of the commitments by both sides don't go far enough to redress that imbalance, and they'll be aware of that as they go into the ballot box.
Now, we had our ABC elections analyst Casey Briggs in a moment ago speaking about the key seats, but just to drive that home, what will be the key areas that the government or the opposition will need to really drive this home and win this election?
Gemma, I think Casey was pretty well on the money. I think Parramatta and Reid are seats that we will watch closely. Reid in particular, but Sally Situ has been very much locally focused, like Daly has been very locally focused every time she's gotten up in Parliament during this term. She said, how will issues affect her electorate? So I think the other seats to watch will be Macarthur. That's one of those high growth areas in outer southwestern Sydney where infrastructure is not keeping up, held by Mike Freelander for Labor. That's one we'll keep an eye on. We need to be aware that too, in seats like Werriwa, in Blaxland and also in Watson, in sort of more inner southwestern Sydney, those seats are complicated because preference flows, for example, on some candidates that have declared themselves as representative of the Islamic vote. Other independents really will throw things up in the air to an extent. They're safe Labor seats. Nobody would have said they were in play, at least 2 or 3 years ago. They are suddenly looking as though, they might factor. And I think the very point that Peter Dutton chose to visit yesterday, McMahon, Chris Bowen's seat, also says to us that they sense that something might be on. The critical factor as well is that the nominations haven't closed. So there is still a chance for some wildcard independents to come into the mix.
So, I mean, it's such a big area, a big population, it's diverse. What does a leader need to do to win the West?
Oh, you've got to rock up and you've got to be authentic. So the things that Peter Dutton was doing yesterday with the Assyrian community, I think Tony Burke and Jason Clare and others have been on the ground. They will be very, very much engaged in local issues, and that's what wins the day in Western Sydney. Michelle Rowland, for example, for Labor, did that very well last time in Greenway. They'll look to repeat that and they'll focus on the local.
Professor Andy Marks, thank you for coming into our Parramatta studios.
Great to be here.
And it's time for the sport with Charles Bryce. Charles, yesterday was the first game for Manly since their captain said he'll be leaving the club. What was the reaction like?
Yeah, it was just days after telling the Manly Sea Eagles that he wanted out at the season's end. Daly Cherry Evans was cheered onto the field for their game against the Parramatta Eels. Sea Eagles fans, they didn't cheer for all that long though, with Tom Trbojevic leaving the field with yet another injury, a medial cruciate ligament is the fear there. Manly cruised to a 26-12 victory. It was a title win for the Warriors over West Tigers. Coming from behind, Luke Metcalf secured the victory with a penalty goal in the 73rd minute.
Now, the biggest game in the West took place last night. Who equalised an impressive record?
Yeah, well, Fremantle has won its first game of the season in a dominant performance in the Western Derby. It was Jai Amiss. He did most of the damage on the scoreboard. He kicked 4 goals as Freo ran out 40-point winners. But Caleb Sarong, he took home a record-equalling 4th Glendinning Allen medal for best on ground. There was also another game yesterday. Taylor Walker turned back time. He kicked 4 goals in the Crows' win over North Melbourne. Unbeaten so far this season. It's the Crows' best start to a season in 9 years.
And staying with the AFL, Richmond have a big decision to make.
Yeah, they'll need to decide today whether to challenge a 3-match ban handed to Ryan Mansell for an incident on Saturday that left St Liam O'Connell concussed. Mansell pushed O'Connell into a contest that resulted in the 22-year-old colliding with Tom Lynch, and he was unable to finish out the game. The act has been graded by the match review officer as careless, severe and also high contact.
Now, we didn't have to wait too long before we saw the first goal in the Women's A-League yesterday.
No, we didn't, Gemma. It took all of 21 seconds before the ball was in the back of the net. Brisbane, that wasn't enough for Brisbane to win over the Central Coast Mariners, though. Midfielder Laini Fryer hitting the back of the net, just seconds into the match. Having already equalised, though, the Mariners made the most of a defensive mix-up and took the 2-1 lead in the 71st minute. Central Coast, they just need 1 point from their remaining 2 matches to secure a place in the finals.
And just quickly, the Central Coast Mariners in the men's got into the winners list.
Yeah, they had their first win in 11 games across all competitions. They beat Perth Glory. It got off to a quick start. Mariners taking the lead after just 5 minutes of play with a stunning header there. Perth then levelled from a corner about 5 minutes later. Mikhail Docker, he scored from the penalty spot. Eventually, the Central Coast Mariners 3-1 winners.
Thanks, Charles. And it's time to check in on the weather with Nate Byrne. What's happening, Nate?
Hey Gemma, we've got lots of wild weather occurring around ex-tropical cyclone Diane in Western Australia and parts of the Territory. Pretty remote country here. Broad area, though, of damaging winds and heavy rainfall as the system continues to weaken and march eastwards. And, of course, I'm keeping an eye on the east because we've got flooding continuing through large parts of Queensland and northern New South Wales. The system that caused all that now a low well off the New South Wales coast, but it's driving some dangerous and hazardous surf into the New South Wales coast there. Lots of heat still in the west that we're watching at the moment, some high fire danger there, and for large parts of the south of the country as well. In terms of the flooding, some relatively good news. There will be a little bit of shower activity across Queensland, but most of the action up in the north, maybe some big falls up that way actually with severe thunderstorms. You can see severe storms around ex-tropical cyclone Diane as well. But it's only a brief reprieve for Queensland and northern New South Wales because what's left of Diane is coming. Probably Wednesday, it'll bring some big falls potentially. A fairly quick burst, but right over those areas dealing with the floods. And then after that, things will settle down quite a bit. But still, it is looking pretty wet through the outlook for large parts of northern Australia. And with that flooding continuing and water still rising for many communities, it's going to be one to watch very, very closely. Essentially, all of Queensland has at least a chance of some wet weather today. Storms in the mix too. Those bigger falls up in the north. 29 for Brisbane, just a possible shower for you today. In New South Wales, it's all what's happening in the east. We've got showers mostly developing in the northeast later and then through the southern parts of the coast. So Sydney, you're dealing with that with the windy 24. Canberra, a couple of possible showers, 22 your top. Victoria has some isolated falls in the east, south of the ranges. Melbourne's getting to 21, it should stay fine. And Tassie has a little bit of wet weather for the east and the south today, including Hobart, where it's getting to 17. South Australia, a couple of drops for the southern facing coasts. That's it, 25 on the way for Adelaide. In WA's west, well, in WA south, I should say, it is pretty warm. We're getting to 34 in Perth. Storms getting down into the southern interior, but most of the focus is through the northern interior. Storms across the Territory as well, Gemma, including for Darwin, where it's getting to 32.
Thank you, Nate, and thank you to you, our viewers. There is more on the ABC News app and on ABC iView. I'm Gemma Veness. We are expecting the opposition leader Peter Dutton to step up shortly, and we will bring you that live as it begins. Stay with us.
Everyone who had anything to do with him probably regrets setting eyes on him.
The Crooked Cop.
Receiving money from informants, it's like putting a fox in charge of the chickens.
He's dealing with the top international drug syndicates. The sums involved are eye-watering.
The Cover-Up.
Why would the Crime Commission mislead the Police Minister and the Parliament?
The secrets finally exposed.
How the could you employ someone like this?
Have you ever committed a crime at all?
Four Corners, tonight, ABC and ABC iView.
Every Monday, there's a lot to talk about. It's over to you to ask the important questions.
Does our current political system reward narcissists?
Who decides what's true and what is not? To challenge power.
Mental health care in this country is inadequate.
Oh, yeah, let me at it. To debate the issues.
It's a strange time to be a man.
We've got a crisis of loneliness.
We are multicultural. God's a swinging voter.
Q&A tonight on ABC and ABC iView.
You're looking at a conservation triumph. You'd think these endangered elephants are universally loved. Not here in Botswana.
An enormous population comes with big problems.
Elephants on the rampage.
Elephants, they kill.
We're making do-it-yourself tear gas.
I can see how that could work. Who's paying the price for this conservation success story?
It's not benefiting us.
Not many people want to conserve what they fear.
Foreign Correspondent, tomorrow at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
Tomorrow, Virginia Trioli returns.
In this series, I'll showcase artists and performers at the peak of their powers.
Every day you start from scratch.
And tell the story of their triumphs.
I've been living to become the singer that I am.
Their stumbles.
Some people just seem to be born with it. I had to find it.
And why they make the glorious work we love so much.
It's pretty intoxicating.
Is there another Mad Max?
We have a story. I could be making movies for another century.
Creative Types with Virginia Trioli. Tomorrow on ABC and ABC iView.
You're with ABC News. It's 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time and 7 a.m. in the West. It's the start of the first full week of the election campaign. The leaders of the major parties are targeting key battleground electorates. The Prime Minister is in Western Australia, while opposition leader is starting the day in the Hunter region of New South Wales. Also ahead, a mother arrested after 3 children are stabbed at a home in Sydney's northwest. US President Donald Trump levels new threats at Russia and Iran. Residents in parts of Queensland and New South Wales are on high alert as floodwaters flow downstream. And Muslims around the world celebrate the end of Ramadan and the start of Eid. It's Monday, the 31st of March. I'm Gemma Veness. This is ABC News Mornings. And it's great to have your company as we broadcast from our new home in Parramatta for the very first time. And this coincides with the first full week of the federal election campaign. We are standing by to take you live to Newcastle in New South Wales, where the opposition leader Peter Dutton is due to speak at any moment. So we'll bring you that live as it gets underway. First though, Anthony Albanese is in Perth on day 3 of the federal election campaign. Political reporter Tom Lowry is travelling with the Prime Minister.
It's a bit interesting to see the Prime Minister travelling west so early in the election campaign, but WA has been very good to Labor in recent years. At the last election, just 3 years ago, Labor picked up 4 seats in WA. It would love to hold all of them. The Prime Minister has tried to make a real point during this last term in office of not taking WA for granted. He's made something like 30 trips out west over the past 3 years and has now come here very, very early on. If Labor can hold all 4 of those seats here in the West, plus be competitive in the new seat of Bullwinkle. That's a 3-way contest between Labor, the Liberals and the National Party. That would make it pretty difficult for Peter Dutton to find a path to office. He is coming with an offering for the West here today, $200 million for the St John of God Midland Hospital. So clearly trying to continue to make that case to WA voters to keep up that relationship and make clear he's not taking them for granted.
And Tom, a YouGov poll has Labor favouring better in recent weeks. How is the government responding to that?
Yeah, there's actually been a few polls that have come out over the past couple of days, Gemma, all showing sort of shifts in Labor's direction just in the past couple of weeks or so. A news poll this morning, a Resolve poll as well, and that YouGov poll you've mentioned. Now, none of them are showing commanding leads for Labor or anything like that. This is still a very tight contest, but clearly that little shift towards Labor just at the start of this campaign. That said, Labor figures say they're not reading too much into the polls at this point. Here's the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, speaking on this morning.
This is a close election. I think everyone knows we're coming from behind. That's the way in which we're proceeding here. But we're also really focused on making sure that we are telling the story to the Australian people about what we've done in relation to focusing on cost of living relief, which has really been our focus since the time that we've come into power.
So the Deputy Prime Minister making the point there, this is still a very